So look what just arrived in the mail. What do you guys think is inside of this box? I'll give you a hint if you're not researching it already. This is an item that I enjoy using and I've made a lot of content on in the past. This is something that probably 85 to 90% of RVers take with them and use when they're RVing. So it's very relevant to RVing, and there's so many different types of this specific product that it's always a good idea to show different variations, simply to give people a different perspective on why different versions of this might suit their lifestyle. But this is a new product and it was sent to me for review and evaluation on the channel. I actually probably get upwards of 20 to 30 requests to review something similar to this. So if you guys figured out what it is yet, hang tight, I'll be right back. You know, something funny is I finally broke out this Cobalt folding pocket knife that I got as a gift a long time ago. It came with a multi-tool, and I never used it for about 2 years because I just figured it'd be trash. I've been using my Benchmade knife, I've been using some of my other knives that I keep around with me as my everyday carry, but I finally broke into this one because it was convenient and I needed a pocket knife at the moment, and I am blown away by the quality of this little knife. It has performed flawlessly through everything I've subjected it through. So very, very cool product, and it's definitely a surprise because I think the entire kit was like $15. And if you haven't figured it out yet, we still have a few more things that are packaged in this really cool box that was right on top. That's pretty cool. I know what that is. Of course, that's a power cable, and it's got a couple little wrenches and tools in here. Do you know yet what this is? Let's keep digging in. Okay, so we have another layer of clues removed. Have you figured it out yet? I'm sure about 98% of people have. But if you haven't, let me know in the comment section. Are you still wondering what it's going to be when I pull all this out? We're getting closer. Okay, so I'm pretty sure you've figured out what this is by now. This is a bicycle, and a lot of people wonder, why am I doing bicycle content? Well, I think most people know by now I'm really into bicycling. This specific bicycle is not necessarily the type of bike I'd normally buy, mainly because I'm into mountain biking. This specific bike is about $1,500, so it's going to be significantly less than a bike I would typically buy, but more importantly, this bike uses road-style tires. Now, these tires are a little thicker than you might normally see on your typical road bike, but this is an e-commuter bike, or an electric commuter bike, and there's a lot of reasons why I chose to review this, whereas I turned down so many other brands that try to send me their equipment. So we're going to get this assembled real quick, and I'm going to explain to you specifically why I was so interested in reviewing this specific bicycle. You know, as I start the process of assembling this bike, the first thing I definitely have to admire is the fact that they sent these two fenders, one for the back wheel and one for the front wheel. But I'd never be caught dead with fenders on my bike. Not because of their functionality. I mean, they probably do a good job of keeping water from spraying on your back and little rocks from hitting you. But I'm a bike snob, and bike snobs don't like fenders on bikes. We call them mud guards when they're on mountain bikes. So they're not fenders, they're mud guards. On here, they're fenders, and they are a no-go. Okay, first impressions before I start assembling it. It was packaged extremely well, but that's pretty common with most bikes. I mean, packaging is very, very similar amongst most bike brands. They'll typically leave the back wheel on. In some cases, they'll take it off, but they'll have the front one almost always on so they can turn the handlebar sideways. They'll have the handlebars removed from the stem, and then they'll have the front wheel kind of zip tied and taped with foam to the bike. And they did a really good job of packaging this bike. The aluminum on this bike, I mean, almost replicates carbon fiber because it is so well done. I mean, all of the welds just look absolutely fantastic. And even though this bike is manufactured in China, something to keep in mind is almost every high-end carbon fiber mountain bike frame actually comes from China. People may not realize that. Almost all of the big name brands that you hear about, their frames are actually manufactured in China. There are a few that are manufactured in Germany and the UK and the US and Australia, but very, very few. And again, if you talk about your super high-end brands, they're generally designed in the country that advertises them, but the frames themselves are usually made in a factory in China. And they have for a long time produced some outstanding carbon fiber frames and outstanding aluminum frames. And this bike is actually a testament to that, because the frame on this bike and the welds are absolutely fantastic. Definitely have to give it a big thumbs up in terms of overall frame construction at this point. And this is an aluminum framed bike. This is not carbon fiber, even though it may look carbon fiber. Just need to mount this wheel up front. We'll go ahead and get the handlebars mounted, and we'll look a little closer at the details of this bike to see what it's all about. So something worth noting is that on your super high-end bikes, you will have a through axle in the front and the rear. Basically, it's a real thick axle that slides into place and then it threads to lock it. And on Fox, they give you this really nice kind of quick connect lock that gives it some pressure so it doesn't come undone while you're riding. On your lower end bikes, you're typically going to have either no axle that can be removed at all, or you're going to have a skewer that goes through. Now, because this is an e-bike and because it uses a rear hub motor, which this is the motor assembly right here, the axle is permanently mounted in place. So you can remove the entire assembly, but you can't simply remove an axle like on some other bikes where you slide it out and you remove the wheel. On my Cannondale over here, because the motor is a mid-mount motor, which is mounted up here near the actual crankset, the axle can be removed back here like it can on any traditional mountain bike. So that's definitely something that you see on higher-end bikes that you typically don't see on your more entry-level bikes. Now up front, it does use the traditional skewer type mount. So you basically put it in place and then you have a little spring clip that you lock, and it locks the wheel assembly in place. Now, something I do kind of like about this bike is that it uses a threadless headset up here, and it is 31.8 millimeters, which is, you know, a lot of bikes are still 31.8. You see some of your beefier mountain bikes going up to 35 millimeter post mount right here, but this specific one is 31.8, which is perfectly fine for a commuter or road style bike. But what's also impressive about this is that it actually has 4 screws that actually connect the handlebars to this. A lot of your lower end bikes will only have 2 screws, and that's a very, very good sign that you're getting a pretty cheap bike. So if you ever see a stem that only has 2 screws that hold the handlebars in place, you are absolutely on the very, very, very entry-level budget side of bikes. And then if you see a bike that does not use a clamp style threadless stem right here, again, you're also on the very entry level of most bikes. Any of your higher end bikes, anything, you know, in the $300 up range, even some that are a little less than that, should have a threadless stem. Basically where the fork goes in, it is smooth, and then this slides over the top of it and clamps into place. But before we mount the handlebars up, one thing I'd like to mention that's an advantage of this type of setup is the fact that you can upgrade it. It's not going to be one of those setups where you're going to be stuck with the same fork. So if I really like how this bike rides and I want to reduce some weight, I could remove this aluminum fork up front, throw a carbon fiber fork in here, and I'd be able to bolt it in place or clamp it in place just like this one. And having a threadless stem like this gives me that ability. So we're going to go and throw the handlebars up, get them torqued down in place, and there's always going to be torque settings right here. So this is set for 6 Newton meters. So we'll go ahead and mount the handlebars. Okay, so the first quality control issue I've seen with this bike is the handlebars are, you know, I want to say they're mounted backwards. I don't know if that's so much the case, but they are definitely not mounted in the correct orientation, simply because the handlebars fit like this if this is how I want him to be on here, but then all of your brake levers are upside down, your controls for your computer are upside down, and your bell is on the wrong side. The way this should be mounted is like this, but there's not enough slack. So the minute you start to turn, it's going to start stretching this computer cable right here, and it's going to cause issues. So what I in essence have to do is remove everything off of the handlebars and flip the handlebars around. But that still may not solve the issue because the wiring for the computer is still going to be too short to reach. And it's all internally routed through the frame, which means that if I put it here, it's either going to rip that off eventually, or I have to mount it the opposite way. So I'm probably just going to have to flip everything around and mount it this way. But again, this is just something that somebody obviously missed before they ship this out. But yeah, all these controls on this side, or basically all the right side controls, should be on the left, and all the left side controls should be on the right. So I have to swap some things around here. The easiest way to make this work would be to try to flip the brake levers and flip the computer over, but have to use everything on this side. It's a little confusing, so I'm gonna have to figure out what I want to do here. Alright, so you all know I try to be fair and honest in everything that I review, and even though this bike was provided to me for review and evaluation, I gotta point out a couple things that so far are kind of frustrating. The first one is, again, the handlebars were all connected the wrong way, and there's not actually enough cabling to get everything situated the right way. So what I in essence have to do is remove everything off of the handlebars and kind of fit things where they're gonna go, which means the brake levers are actually gonna be backwards. So I'm gonna have the brake lever on this side that would traditionally be on this side, and vice versa. Now the other issue that I'm running into, and this is actually a really serious one if you plan on riding this and being safe, I am trying to actually attach the handlebars to the stem. And when I was pulling these bolts out that actually thread into place, you can see how this one right here is crooked. And these, the top and bottom bolts right here, are actually threaded into place crooked. And you can see how they're both crooked. These two bolts, they're both at an angle like this, and if I continue to tighten them down, they are going to cross thread, or they're simply going to put some very, very awkward strain on the bolt assembly. So that's definitely something that I don't want to see happen, and because of that, I'm going to be removing this stem and actually replacing it with a parts bin stem that I took off of my buddy's bike that I built up for him. So I'm going to put this giant stem in place of this factory stem. Now this is a much shorter stem, which I'm actually fine with. I usually like a shorter stem on a mountain bike. Typically on a road bike you have a longer stem like this, but yeah, I'm going to throw this shorter stem on here because I know that the bolts on here are perfectly straight and aligned. I'm still going to use this handlebar though. I would love to replace this handlebar with another one that I have. The challenge I may run into there is I won't have the slack in the cables to actually reach the wider width of the other handlebars that I have. So now we have a giant stem with a Cane Creek cap for the top. Okay, so I finally have everything switched over. I had to keep the computer on this side still, even though it's designed to be on this side, because the cable wouldn't be long enough and every time I turn it would stretch. I got the brakes switched over and I removed all of the little wire loom that they had around everything, which was really preventing these from moving. So it actually looks a little bit more like a normal bike now when you remove some of that stuff. But yeah, I had to take it all off. I mounted the headlight that's included up front. This does have hydraulic disc brakes, which is actually pretty impressive, even though they're from a brand I haven't heard of before called X-Spark. They look to be Shimano copies. But so far they've worked pretty good, at least here on the stand. And they definitely have some grabbing power. And the computer is still on the opposite side of the direction that it normally would be on, so this is typically on this side. The handlebars are facing the right way, and I really couldn't just flip them like I'm sure some people think, because there's a sweep and a rise to these handlebars that need to be the correct way, otherwise the handlebars will kind of be dipping down and it's not going to feel natural. But everything really looks good, and now that the cables are kind of oriented in the right direction, everything looks better, especially not having this stuff on the cables right here. It looked nice. It kind of cleaned them up a little bit. I might put it in some areas, but again, if you're used to traditional bikes, everything's kind of out like this. The bike looks super nice. I mean, it is a very, very good looking setup. A few initial impressions. I really like the fact that it has hydraulic disc brakes. That is something in this price point that is kind of rare unless you're looking at a traditional bike. Whenever you get into e-bikes, it's kind of rare to have hydraulic brakes on this type of bike. You know, on a traditional bike, you get it into that $600 price range is really when you're going to start seeing hydraulic brakes on bikes. But whenever you look at e-bikes, you typically have to be in about the $2,000 range before you see them. The downside is they're not a brand that people have heard of. They're, again, X-Spark, which I'm not familiar with. But again, they look exactly the same as Shimano brakes. So you know, they're probably going to work just fine for this application. The tires are definitely a little wider than a typical road bike tire. They're probably about twice as wide as your typical road bike tire, which is going to be really nice because it's going to give you a little bit more of a smoother ride. The bike looks very much like a very nice, well-built road bike though, so that is really nice. It does come with pedals. It also comes with a rear light as well that's battery powered with a charger, so you can charge up that battery. and the front one runs off of the battery internally, which is in this tube right here, and you can charge it right there. It does come with a AC adapter for both European and US spec chargers. I like the fact that it has the dual bolt on or dual clamp on grips, which is really nice up front. The handlebars themselves are impressively light. I thought that this was going to be heavier than it was, but it's actually pretty light. And for a second I thought about throwing my Cannondale handlebar on here, the one that I removed from my mountain bike, but it's a little too wide. I think this width is more appropriate for this size of bike. But yeah, everything is really nice so far. Before we take it out on its maiden voyage, what you want to know about this bike is it does not have shifters. So this does not have a rear derailleur or a front derailleur. It doesn't have any shifters up front on the handlebar either. What it does have is a belt-driven drive system. Now, I recently reviewed another bike very similar to this that also had a belt-driven drive system, but it came with mechanical disc brakes instead of hydraulic disc brakes. And the frame wasn't quite as refined looking as this frame. So the only thing I can really knock this bike so far on is the fact that the stem up front was threaded wrong. But you know, I can kind of give them a pass on that simply because they probably don't even produce their own stem. It's probably another company that they sourced it from, and that's where they had the manufacturing issue. And then the handlebars were set up backwards, but I was able to get that all straightened away. And I think most people know, even if you get a custom bike or you get a high-end bike, most of it has to completely be assembled at whoever's building it for you, and those things are addressed before you ever even pick it up. But again, those are some things that I did want to point out. In terms of how comfortable the saddle is, I don't know yet until I take this thing for a spin, which I'm about to do. Okay, so before I take this out on a ride, let me point out a few other things. This has aluminum wheels, which are nice. It has a kind of a reflective pinstripe here on the tire, which is kind of cool, but it uses Schrader valves and not Presta valves, so I was kind of hoping it would be Presta valves. But the nice thing about Schrader valves is that it's very easy to fill it up with just about any tire pump, because not a lot of tire pumps are set up for Presta, whereas Schrader valves are pretty much the universal common standard. So we're going to go ahead and air up the tires. It says recommended PSI is between 50 and 75 pounds. We'll probably load it up to about 60 pounds. And these are 700 by 38C tires, so it's the equivalent of a 29-inch wheel diameter on, say, a mountain bike. So let's get some air in the tires and take off. Okay, so let's go over some of the technical details on this bike. First of all, it uses a 250 watt rear hub motor. It has 40 Newton meters of torque. It has a Gates carbon belt drive, so it's supposed to be far more durable than a chain. But, you know, it's hard for me to quantify that simply because all of my high-end mountain bikes have always used a chain. It has a integrated 252 watt-hour battery. It has a range of about 43.5 miles on a full charge, and that's generally in your assist modes. Up top here on the cockpit, it has 3 power assist modes. You have off, and then you have 1, 2, and 3. It has a top speed of up to 20 miles an hour, and here's one that a lot of people are going to want to know about. So the overall weight of this bike is only about 34 pounds, so it's actually very light. I think closer to 33 pounds. So very light, and there are ways you can reduce the weight even more. Go to a lighter weight seat post, go to a lighter weight front fork, lighter weight handlebars. You know, there's a lot of areas that you can shave down a little bit more weight if you want to get it closer to that 30-pound mark. But it is pretty nice. It only comes in 2 frame sizes. So basically the 2 frame sizes will cover riders between 5 foot 5 inches and 6 feet tall. Of course, you know, you put a taller seat post on, you can probably be a bit taller. You can modify your front stem, go with a wider handlebar. There are things that you can do to make this accommodate riders that might be a little bit taller. As far as riders that might be shorter, the problem you're going to have then is going to be this top tube possibly being too tall for most of them. But again, this is a pretty cool bike. I'm about to take it out to see how this thing works. Okay, so I took it for a ride and I thought that it was already in kind of a ready-to-go mode, and then I realized that you need to put a password in to unlock it. And the password, at least the default password right off the bat, is all zeros, and those were those little boxes you saw down at the bottom. And once you unlock it, it's going to give you your current speed, it's going to give you how far you've ridden, and it's also going to give you your power assist levels and what your battery life is remaining. Obviously the battery's nearly dead. I'm going to need to charge it up a little bit, but I'll try to take it out for a ride now just to see how it feels. Maybe there's enough charge to demonstrate it. And we should be able to go through some menus here. Hopefully I can go into the settings, and I'm going to try to readjust the settings so it's under miles per hour and miles instead of kilometers. But we're going to take it for a quick ride to see how it feels. Okay, so I got about a mile on it before the battery died, but I was able to mess with all 3 power assist modes, and it picks up speed quick. It's actually very, very smooth in terms of how it accelerates and the sensitivity of the pedals. And I would argue to say it's actually as smooth, if not smoother, than some far more expensive bikes. Pretty impressed. Wasn't so impressed with, again, some of the issues I had up here with the cockpit. You know, the wheels, there's a lot of weight there in the wheels, and even the tires. So like I said, you could shave a lot of weight off this bike if you wanted to by replacing some components. And the good thing about this bike is a lot of the components can be replaced. Keep in mind, it is single speed, and it's a pretty high gear. So, you know, it's one of those bikes that it's probably the equivalent of being in probably one of your top gears on a traditional road bike. So even if you're not using the pedal assist mode, you can pedal pretty comfortably at about 20 miles per hour without having to worry about pedaling so fast. You know, if you were in a lower gear, those pedals would be spinning really fast to maintain a higher speed. The brakes work pretty good. Definitely have to get the brakes bedded in. Basically means that you hit the brakes really hard several times over short rides, just so the brake pads seat properly and bed themselves into the rotors themselves. But yeah, it's pretty fun so far. I've been pretty happy with it, just with the short little ride I've been able to take. But the battery died completely on me. It's going to give me an opportunity to plug it in, give it a good charge, go over the manual a little bit more, see how I can adjust some of the settings on the computer screen itself. Very cool, and it's lightweight. So that's really the story behind this. To have an e-bike that weighs 33 pounds is pretty great. And again, I could probably get this bike down to around 30 pounds, which again, for an e-bike is pretty fantastic, especially considering how stealthy it is. You could easily take this bike out with all of your, you know, your road bikey friends, and they probably wouldn't have a clue that this is an e-bike. They'd just be confused at how you're able to keep up with them with a single speed. Now, if they decide to go for a 150-mile ride, you're in for a rude awakening once your battery dies and you are pedaling purely, you know, under your own power. Anyways, guys, I will put a link to this in the description of this video if this is something you're interested in. In terms of value, I think it's a pretty extraordinary value. You know, the stem, I hope that's not a problem other people have. It was definitely one that I wasn't going to install it with the current stem that was on there. Aside from that, everything else on this bike fits really well. The head on it is absolutely very smooth. It is a very, very quiet bike, and it's fun to ride. So I'm going to plug this in, let it get a much longer charge, and spend some more time on it and see how I like it. Anyways, guys, I sure hope you enjoyed this video. If you haven't had a chance, please take a moment, subscribe to my channel, give me a thumbs up, and we'll talk to you again very soon.